Have you ever wondered what secrets might be buried beneath a place everyone else has already forgotten? In a quiet mountain town, a veteran named Daniel inherited nothing more than an old garage and a handful of memories. But on a stormy night, his loyal German shepherd, Scout, caught something hidden beneath the floor: a tunnel, a legacy, and a fight no one saw coming. What would you do if the past you uncovered could change everything? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The wind moved slowly through Clearwater that morning, carrying a soft chill across the empty highway. A thin mist hovered near the ground, and the gray sky pressed low, as if waiting. The old auto shop stood at the bend of Route 17, peeling paint curling like old paper, windows fogged with decades of dust, and the faded sign Carter Auto Repairs swung weakly from a single rusty chain. The air smelled faintly of pine and engine oil. Daniel Harris stood facing the building, with his hands deep inside the pockets of a worn green work jacket. At 47, he carried the kind of weight that rested in the eyes long before it showed in the shoulders. His face was lean and sun-browned, his jaw firm, lined with a few days of rough stubble. His short black hair was streaked with gray at the temples. A small scar cut beneath his left ear, a quiet mark from a night convoy half a world away. His boots crunched the gravel as he walked closer, each step slow and deliberate. Daniel had seen broken buildings before, places where time forgot to look back. But this was different. This building carried his past. It was the only thing left to him by Uncle Ray, the man who had taught him how to change oil and patch up engines when he was just a boy. Scout moved beside him with silent steps. The German shepherd was 6 years old, his coat a strong blend of black and tan, his eyes bright amber, his ears upright and alert. His movements were disciplined, but quiet, the kind of calm that came from years of training. He was once a working dog, trained to detect danger, but now he was Daniel's shadow, steady and loyal. Daniel pulled away the rusted padlock and pushed the garage door open. The metal groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep. The air inside was sharp with oil and damp concrete. Dust floated through the light like tiny grains of time. Old workbenches sat against the wall, covered with forgotten rags and broken tools. Daniel whispered under his breath, his voice rough and low. He had not expected to inherit anything. Life after the Marines had been a string of heavy boots and short-term jobs. He had worked construction, hauled freight, patched roofs. None of it had felt like a life, just survival. And now this building stood before him, asking him to remember. Scout trotted ahead toward the inspection pit in the center of the floor. His tail stiffened as he sniffed along the edges. A low sound came from his throat, not quite a bark, but enough to make Daniel frown. He crouched beside the pit, placed his hand on the cold metal grate, and pushed. The steel shifted with a dull groan. Below was nothing but darkness. Still, something about that dark space pressed against his senses. His pulse gave a quiet kick. Combat had taught him that silence sometimes speaks louder than noise. He forced his breathing slow. It was just a pit. But it did not feel like just a pit. The sound of the front door opening made him turn. Sarah Collins stepped inside, bringing the gray light with her. She was in her late 30s, tall and long-limbed, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid. Her skin was pale and lightly freckled. Her blue eyes carried a sharp, practiced calm. She wore a dark coat and thick boots, the look of someone who had walked through more than one forgotten property. Sarah closed the door behind her with a quick push. Her voice was even, measured, professional. She introduced herself as the agent sent from Clearwater Realty to hand over the papers. Her tone held the smooth confidence of someone who negotiated for a living. Daniel brushed his hands against his jeans and nodded with a small, dry smile. His voice carried the kind of humor that comes from people who have learned to live with their own bruises. Sarah walked around the shop with quick, efficient steps. She did not pretend it was beautiful. She simply said the land was worth something to developers and that he could sell, walk away, and start again somewhere warm. Daniel did not answer at once. Warmth was a strange word for him. The last warm place, he remembered, was a desert halfway across the world. That was not home. He looked at Scout, who tilted his head slightly. The dog seemed to sense the quiet storm in him. She handed him an envelope with the title, Deed, Old Keys, and several faded photographs. In one photo, Uncle Ray stood in front of the same shop, his shoulders broad, jaw covered with a full beard, wearing a grin that could make any bad day soften. Daniel remembered his uncle's laugh, deep and rumbling like an engine that never stalled. Sarah spoke simply. He was the only heir. No debts, no hidden contracts, only a building and the land beneath it. She told him to call if he decided to sell. Then she left, her boots tapping lightly against the pavement as the wind pushed the door shut behind her. The silence filled the room again. Daniel lowered himself onto an old crate near the pit. Scout leaned against his leg, warm and steady. Daniel rubbed the dog's head and let the weight of the moment settle. He had not asked for this place, but now it was his. His gaze returned to the grate. Scout moved toward it, sniffed again, and glanced back at Daniel. There was something down there. He could feel it, not in his ears, but in his chest. He climbed down a few steps on the old ladder fixed to the side of the pit. The cold smell of damp concrete hit him. The beam of his flashlight swept across cracked walls. It was nothing visible. Yet something about it whispered of things hidden, long buried. He climbed back up slowly, closed the grate, and stood still in the middle of the empty shop. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. The faded sign banged softly against the metal pole. Daniel pocketed the key, ran a hand down Scout's head, and whispered without thinking. He would not sell. Not yet. Not before he understood what this place was hiding. Scout followed him to the door, ears alert, but tail steady. Behind them, the old shop stood quiet, but something below waited. Daniel felt it, and for the first time in years, something inside him began to stir again. The morning settled over Clearwater with a thin, colorless light. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet leaves and machine oil, and the mist that had rolled in at dawn was thinning slowly. Inside the auto shop, the quiet had a weight to it, like old breath trapped in metal and concrete. The sound of Daniel's boots against the floor echoed through the space as he moved toward the inspection pit again. The grate was still shut, but Scout had already found it. The German shepherd's tail was lifted, his head lowered, and his nose moved slowly along the edges of the steel. His ears tilted forward with that sharp stillness that meant he had caught something Daniel could not. His coat shimmered faintly in the pale light from the open bay door, black and tan against the gray. Daniel had learned to trust that body language. Scout did not waste energy. If the dog stayed still, something mattered. Daniel crouched and placed both hands on the grate. Cold metal pressed against his palms. He could feel a faint give in the steel, like it wanted to move but had not in years. His heartbeat began to thrum steadily, the same steady pulse that used to build before patrol nights overseas. He pushed harder. The grate shifted, with a sound like a distant groan. A puff of cold, stale air lifted against his face, carrying with it a scent he could not quite name. Scout let out a low chuff. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and leaned over the opening. The dark below looked thicker than air, like it had weight. He climbed halfway down the ladder fixed to the side of the pit, the rungs cold against his fingers. His flashlight beam cut across cracked concrete. Then he saw it. A metal panel had been welded into the side wall beneath the pit. The welds were thin, old, like whoever sealed it did not expect it to hold forever. He reached out and ran his fingertips along the edge. The panel moved slightly under the pressure. A set of bolts lined its frame, eaten through by rust. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew this feeling. Not fear. Focus. The same narrowing of the world that came when you knew something was waiting to be found. He climbed back up and grabbed a crowbar from the workbench. The handle was pitted and slick from age, but it held. Scout paced above the grate, ears twitching, tail low. Daniel forced the tip of the crowbar under the lip of the panel and pried hard. Metal screamed as it came loose. The panel swung open, and a rush of colder air hit him in the face. Beneath it was not more concrete. It was a black void, deeper than he expected. He aimed the flashlight down and caught the shimmer of a narrow metal staircase leading into the dark. Each step was coated in a layer of dust. His light brushed over the far wall and found a single line carved into the concrete. The letters were rough but clear. Harbor Line. Daniel stayed, crouched there for a long moment. He had no helmet, no rope. No way to know if the stairs were safe or if they would drop him into some collapsed basement. But his pulse quickened again. Something about those two words struck a deep place inside him. A line, a path. He tightened his grip on the crowbar without realizing it. Scout stood at the edge of the pit, looking down with bright eyes. He did not bark. He simply waited. The dog had learned Daniel's rhythms over years together. He knew when Daniel's mind was running down a dangerous path. Daniel whispered a quiet promise to himself. He would not go down there today. Not yet. He needed a proper flashlight, maybe rope, maybe someone who knew something about Harbor Line. But he also knew one thing with complete clarity. This was not just some leftover maintenance shaft. Someone had built this with purpose. He pulled the panel back into place, pushed the grate over the pit, and locked it down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. It was still morning, but his heart felt as if it had been walking for miles. As he stepped outside to catch a breath, the sky had brightened, the mist now thinning into the forest edge. Parked on the cracked asphalt out front was a black SUV that had not been there before. Clean, new, a sharp contrast to the rusting sign and the old shop. A man leaned casually against the front fender, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a long dark coat. He looked like he belonged to some other world entirely, one with clean walls and expensive coffee. The man was tall, lean but not thin, with sandy blonde hair combed back carefully. His skin was pale with a faint tan, the kind that comes from short business trips but not labor. He had a narrow jaw, clean shaven, and a mouth that did not quite know how to smile naturally. His eyes were a pale gray, quick and watchful. When Daniel stepped out, those eyes studied him the way a surveyor studies land. The man straightened his coat and approached with a practiced ease. He introduced himself as Michael Crane from Skyline Holdings. His voice was smooth, measured, and carried no hint of the cold air around them. He did not reach out to shake hands immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch for a beat, testing the space between them. Daniel crossed his arms loosely over his chest. The gesture was casual, but the weight behind it was clear. He had dealt with men like this before. Different setting, same eyes. Michael finally offered a hand. Daniel took it. The handshake was firm, controlled, and as impersonal as a business contract. Michael glanced at the building, his gaze sweeping over the rusted roofline and broken sign without disgust, only calculation. He said he was interested in purchasing the property. Skyline Holdings, he explained, was expanding its commercial development near the highway. His tone made it sound like the entire future of the town rested on a clean parking lot and a convenience store. Daniel did not answer immediately. He was listening, but his mind was still half inside the dark stairwell under the floor. Michael continued. He explained that Skyline could offer a generous sum, enough for Daniel to move anywhere he wanted, enough to start a new life far from the rust and the dust. His words were smooth, shaped to sound like opportunity. Scout stood next to Daniel now, shoulders squared, head high. His presence had weight. Michael's eyes flicked toward the dog briefly, then back to Daniel. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm, even, but carried the steadiness of someone who had learned to say no in far worse situations. He told Michael he was not interested in selling. Not now. The faint smile that had been resting on Michael's mouth thinned slightly, but did not break. He tilted his head just enough to suggest disappointment without losing control. He said Skyline would leave the offer open. Then he turned and walked back to the SUV, his steps slow and even. The engine started without sound. The tires whispered against the asphalt, and the vehicle disappeared down the road. Daniel stood in the quiet that followed, Scout at his side. The forest at the edge of the property whispered faintly with the wind. He felt the weight of what had just happened settle into his gut. He did not know this man or the company, but he knew how to read the tone behind a soft voice. They had come because they wanted something, and they would come again. He turned back toward the building. The grate was closed, the stairs hidden beneath it like a secret breathing under the floor. His hand brushed Scout's back, the dog's fur warm against his palm. Daniel had spent years following orders. Now there were none, only choices. And today, he had made one. He would not sell. He would find out what Harbor Line meant before he let anyone take it. He locked the bay door behind him as the mist finally lifted off the highway, leaving only clear sky and the quiet hum of wind through the pines. The day opened with a pale sun that hung low above Clearwater, its light soft as if it had been filtered through a thin layer of glass. The air was still, touched with the faint scent of pine needles and the sound of a distant train rolling slowly through the valley. Frost clung to the edges of the highway signs, catching the early light like shards of glass. Daniel Harris zipped up his worn green jacket and locked the bay door of the auto shop behind him. Scout padded silently at his heel, the German shepherd's amber eyes alert, breath steaming faintly in the cold air. In his pocket, folded carefully, was the old ticket, the photograph, and a thin scrap of paper bearing the carved letters, harbor line. The weight of those small things was more than their size. Each step toward town felt like walking further into someone else's story. Daniel stopped outside the Clearwater Historical Society, a squat brick building with peeling green trim and a weathered sign that leaned slightly forward as though tired of standing against time. He had passed this building 100 times, but never stepped inside. Today, his pulse beat steady in his ears. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, dust, and something warm, like linseed oil. Wooden filing cabinets lined the walls, and a grandfather clock ticked patiently at the far end of the room. Behind a long oak desk sat Helen Brooks. Helen was in her early 60s, of medium height, with silver hair cut in a straight bob just below her ears. Her skin was pale but healthy, with lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often, even if she was not smiling now. Her green eyes were sharp and alive, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She wore a dark cardigan over a cream blouse, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a delicate gold chain rested against her throat. Helen had spent her life digging through forgotten archives, and it showed in the way she carried herself, shoulders square, chin lifted, like a woman used to fighting for old truths no one else bothered to defend. Daniel approached slowly, feeling strangely out of place in a room filled with stories that did not belong to him. Helen looked up from a stack of faded maps and assessed him in a glance. Her expression softened slightly when she noticed Scout standing at his side. She asked what she could help him with, her voice even and warm, the kind of voice that wrapped itself around words carefully. Daniel unfolded the ticket and the scrap of paper, laying them on the desk. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer, the light from the small desk lamp brushing across the silver strands of her hair. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes moved across the carved letters, then to the ticket, then back again. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its easy warmth. It was quieter, weightier. She said Harbor Line was not just a name. It was a route. Daniel asked her what kind of route. She leaned back in her chair and looked at him steadily, as if trying to measure how much to say. Then she began to explain. Many decades ago, during a time when crossing borders could mean life or death, a hidden passage through this region had helped people escape. The Harbor Line, she said, was part of an underground network leading through the mountains to the Canadian border. She spoke without drama, only quiet clarity. It had helped fugitives, refugees, and people hunted for who they were or what they believed. Most records had been destroyed long ago, but whispers remained. Some said a station point had once existed somewhere near Clearwater. Daniel listened carefully, every word carving itself into the corners of his mind. He had spent years in places where people either ran or chased. The thought that beneath his uncle's garage was once a path for survival made the ground under his feet feel different. Helen looked at him again, this time with more intensity. She asked where he had found the ticket and the carving. Daniel hesitated for a brief second, then told her about the staircase beneath the inspection pit, about the darkness below, and the words carved into the wall. Her hands tightened around the edge of the desk as he spoke. She had spent her life studying history, but this was not theory. This was real. She stood slowly and walked to a cabinet near the back wall, pulling out a thick folder tied with faded string. Inside were old maps of the region. She spread one out on the desk, her finger tracing a faint dotted line that cut through Clearwater and wound toward the northern mountains. She told him that if his building really sat on the remains of the harbor line, then it was more than an inheritance. It was a piece of living history. For Daniel, the words landed like a quiet blow. History was something he had spent most of his life walking away from. Now it was sitting beneath his boots. He ran a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping against his fingers. He did not know whether to feel anger, awe, or the old weight that came from responsibility he never asked for. Helen advised him to be careful. A sight like that would draw attention, not all of it good. She did not know who else might already know about it, but she promised to help him verify what he had found. Her voice softened slightly when she glanced down at Scout. She said sometimes history finds people who are strong enough to hold it, even if they do not want it. As Daniel left the building, a cold wind lifted across the street. He pulled his jacket tighter and felt Scout brush against his leg as they walked back toward the garage. The sun was higher now, but weak, as if it did not trust the sky to hold it. When he reached the mailbox outside the garage, a single white envelope was waiting. No name, no return address. The Skyline Holdings logo was stamped in faint gray across the corner. Inside was a short printed message. Legal notice of obstruction. Immediate consultation required. Daniel read the lines twice. Skyline had wasted no time. He could almost hear Michael Crane's smooth, careful voice beneath the flat printed words. They wanted the land, and now they were not asking. His grip on the paper tightened. Scout gave a quiet growl, a sound low and steady, like a drumbeat in the dark. Daniel's chest felt heavy, not from fear, from the familiar sense of something approaching, the same pressure that had filled the air before convoys rolled into bad nights overseas. He lifted his eyes to the tree line across the highway. The wind moved through the pines with a whispering sound. Underneath his feet lay a tunnel that had once carried people toward hope. Now the ground above it was about to become a battleground of another kind. Daniel folded the letter, pushed it deep into his jacket pocket, and looked down at Scout. The dog met his eyes without wavering. This time, Daniel did not feel like a man standing over broken concrete. He felt like a man standing at the mouth of something much larger than himself. The night settled over Clearwater with the weight of a storm. The wind came first, low and steady like a warning whispered against the forest. Then the rain began to fall, cutting lines through the darkness. A cold current rolled through the open gaps of the old garage, making the rusted beams creak as if remembering old winters. Lightning flared somewhere beyond the hills, bleaching the pines in brief white flashes. Daniel Harris stood in the center of the auto shop with the bay door shut tight, listening. The building felt smaller in the storm, the kind of small that comes when the world outside turns wild. Scout paced near the inspection pit, his black and tan coat darkened by the damp air, his ears high and sharp. His body was tense, tail low, but controlled. The German Shepherd had lived through sandstorms, gunfire, and noise that never ended. Storms did not frighten him, but something below the floor had caught his attention. Daniel tightened the strap on the flashlight that crossed his chest. His breath fogged the air in soft bursts. He had spent the entire day trying to ignore the feeling building inside him, a steady pulse that told him the tunnel beneath the grate was more than just an old shaft. But the storm had a way of peeling the silence away. And now there was only the sound, a dull, rhythmic echo from below, like a breath moving through hollow concrete. Scout stopped pacing and lowered his head to the grate. His ears twitched once. A low growl rolled from deep in his chest. That sound was not for the rain. That sound meant something was real. Daniel crouched beside the pit, pressing his palm against the cold steel. A small tremor ran through it, not from wind, but from the hollow beneath. His stomach tightened. He had told himself he would wait until daylight, until better equipment, until the world felt less thin. But waiting no longer felt like an option. He pulled the grate back slowly. The metal moaned against the storm. Cold air rose from the tunnel, sharper than the air above. He clicked the flashlight on and clipped a small lantern to his belt. Scout moved close to the opening, steady as always, waiting for the command that had guided him through half a lifetime of danger. Daniel swung his legs onto the ladder and began to descend. The steps were slick with condensation, and the damp smell of earth pressed closer the farther down he went. Scout followed easily, his paws careful but sure, his movement quiet. The light reached the tunnel floor, a narrow passage carved into old concrete. Dust hung thick in the beam like a fog that time had forgotten to clear. He stepped forward slowly. The tunnel stretched straight ahead, low and tight, the walls marked with the faint lines of old tools. His light brushed across the word Harbor Line again, carved roughly into the wall. Beneath it, something else. A single handprint, old and half faded. Daniel's throat tightened. For a moment, the air in the tunnel felt heavier, as if it still carried the weight of the people who once passed through here. He and Scout moved forward. The dog's nails tapped softly against the floor, tail stiff, ears in constant motion. Daniel's boots echoed in the confined space. Every sound seemed louder underground. Every breath seemed to draw the tunnel closer around them. When the beam of the flashlight touched the far wall, he saw it. A slab of cement sealed into the tunnel like a wound stitched over something important. The surface was rough, uneven, and different from the original structure. Someone had closed it quickly, not carefully. Daniel crouched, running his fingers across the edge. The cement was old but brittle. He tapped it lightly with the handle of the crowbar he had brought. A hollow sound answered back. He froze for a heartbeat. Hollow meant space. Space meant something hidden. Scout lowered his head, nose pressed to the seam, and let out another low sound. His body shifted forward, tail still, not fearful, but alert. Daniel had followed that instinct before, and survived places most men didn't. He brushed the loose dust away with his sleeve. It came off like gray smoke, revealing the outline of something buried just behind the wall. He hit the cement again, harder this time. A small crack spidered out from the impact, then another. Bits of debris fell to the ground. Beneath the dull roar of the storm above, he could hear the hollow breathing of the tunnel deepen. As he worked the crowbar under the loosened edge, something shifted. A panel of cement broke free and clattered to the floor. Inside, the gap was a small cavity. His light reached in and struck metal. Daniel reached through the broken opening and pulled out a tin box. It was cold and coated in fine dust, the edges worn smooth with time. A simple latch held it shut. For a moment he just held it, his fingers pressed against the weight of it. It felt heavier than it should have been. Scout stood still beside him, watching. Rainwater somewhere above dripped faintly through unseen cracks. Daniel opened the latch. Inside the box was an old leather-bound notebook, brittle around the edges, and a torn scrap of map folded beneath it. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he lifted the book. It smelled like dry paper and machine oil. The handwriting on the first page was unmistakable. His uncle's. The words were simple. When fear rules, let this path carry the light. For a long time, Daniel did not move. The storm outside roared against the roof of the world, but in the tunnel, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that sits deep in the chest. His uncle had never spoken of anything like this, but he had always been a man who believed in purpose over noise. Daniel remembered the way he used to say, "Not every war wore a uniform." He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket, then slipped the notebook inside the tin box again. As he stood, Scout pressed against his leg, warm and steady. The tunnel no longer felt like a void. It felt like a message. They climbed back up slowly, the storm's breath meeting them at the grate. Rain hit the roof in hard sheets. Daniel closed the pit carefully and sat on the floor of the garage for a long time, the box in his hands. This was not just old cement and rusted stairs. It was history with a heartbeat. And now it was in his care. The morning broke cold and clear, a thin veil of fog still clinging to the edges of Clearwater. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and sharp. A soft wind moved through the pine trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth. The small town hall sat at the end of Main Street, its brick walls darkened by rain, and its front steps slick with dew. Daniel Harris stood near the entrance, hands deep in his jacket pockets, the tin box with the journal and map tucked safely under his arm. Scout waited beside him, tail low but ears alert, the German shepherd's breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. Daniel had spent most of his life in places where gatherings meant briefings, orders, or danger. But this felt different. It wasn't a meeting of soldiers. It was neighbors, people who had walked past his uncle's shop for years without ever looking twice. Yet today, they would talk about what lay beneath it. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with a strange mix of responsibility and uncertainty. Inside, rows of wooden chairs had been set up. A portable heater hummed softly at the front of the room. Helen Brooks stood near the podium, flipping through her notes with steady hands. She wore a long, dark coat and a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck, her silver hair catching the light from the windows. She moved with the calm focus of someone who understood the weight of stories and how they could shape the world. The townsfolk began to arrive in a slow, quiet stream. Most were older, faces lined with years of memory, boots heavy with the kind of steps that had built the town. Among them was Henry Wallace, a retired railway worker in his 70s. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but slightly stooped now, with white hair and a weathered face carved by sun and wind. Henry had lived in Clearwater his whole life. He had a way of speaking that carried the weight of decades without ever trying too hard. Helen opened the gathering with a few clear words about history, about the harbor line, about what they had found beneath the auto shop. She did not sensationalize. She simply laid the facts out like stones across a river. Daniel stood to the side with Scout, watching the faces in the crowd. Some eyes narrowed with skepticism, but many softened with something else: recognition. Henry raised his hand and asked to speak. When he walked to the front, his boots echoed softly against the floor. His hands trembled a little as he leaned on his cane, but his voice was steady. He told the room about stories his father had whispered when he was a boy. Stories of a line that ran through the dark, carrying people who had nowhere else to go. His father had worked the rails at night, guiding those who walked without being seen. Henry said he never thought it was real. But the moment he saw the carved letters Harbor Line in the photo Helen had shown, the memories came back like smoke from a long, cold fire. Others spoke after him. Margaret Field, a retired teacher in her late 60s, short with a soft, round face and a sharp tongue, remembered a winter night when her grandmother had given bread and coats to strangers who vanished by morning. A younger man, Chris Nolan, in his early 30s, with short, sandy hair and the heavy hands of a mechanic, said he had heard rumors but never believed them. Now, hearing these voices, he understood they were more than rumors. Daniel stood still, listening to the weight of each word. These were not his memories, but the tunnel under the shop no longer felt like a secret belonging to him alone. It belonged to the town, to their past. After the meeting, 2 reporters from a small regional paper approached Helen. They were a man and a woman, both young, dressed in thick jackets, their camera gear still damp from the fog. They asked questions, took photographs, and promised to run the story. Daniel noticed how fast word could move once it left a room. Later that afternoon, when Daniel returned to the garage, the road outside no longer looked quiet. Skyline Holdings had sent workers. A temporary chain-link fence had gone up around the property. Signs warning of restricted access flapped in the wind. Michael Crane wasn't there, but Daniel could feel his hand behind the move. The timing was too clean to be chance. Scout growled softly at the fence, his hackles lifting. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's back. He could feel his own heartbeat tighten again, the same rhythm it took on when something shifted from quiet to conflict. Helen arrived with 2 people from the town council, a man named Roy Tanner and a woman named Linda Gray. Roy was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with a deep-lined brow and a sharp, practical mind shaped by years of running a lumber yard. Linda was in her 40s, tall and lean, with black hair streaked with silver and an unshakable calm. Both carried the air of people used to weighing sides before picking one. They followed Daniel and Scout into the tunnel. Scout took the lead, moving slowly but surely. About 20 feet in, he stopped abruptly, ears pointed, nose down. Daniel knelt where the dog stood. The ground dipped slightly, the concrete cracked and thin. One more step from someone unaware, and the floor could have given way. Roy crouched down with a flashlight. He muttered something low under his breath, something that carried both surprise and respect. Linda took notes quietly, her eyes scanning the structure with focus. This was no ordinary hole in the ground. The next day, the council called an emergency session. Helen spoke with precision and force. Daniel sat in the back, Scout at his feet, as the debate moved back and forth between risk, cost, and history. In the end, the council voted unanimously to issue a temporary hold on any demolition or construction. The site would be examined for historical preservation. When Daniel walked out of the hall that night, the stars were out. Cold air brushed against his skin. But for the first time in years, the weight in his chest felt lighter. Scout leaned against his leg, tail wagging slightly. The tunnel beneath the shop was no longer a burden on his shoulders alone. It had become the town's story. And that made all the difference. The morning was cold and damp, with a thin mist drifting low through the trees around Clearwater. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the ground still held its weight in silence. The forest near the edge of town smelled of wet pine, and the air was still enough to make each sound feel sharper than it should. Daniel Harris stood at the entrance of the tunnel beneath the old auto shop, the weight of a crowbar in his hand and the weight of responsibility on his chest. Scout stood next to him, the German shepherd's fur slightly damp, ears forward, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Daniel had spent the last few days moving between meetings with the council, tense standoffs with Skyline workers outside the fence, and quiet nights reading through his uncle's notebook. The entries were brief, written in hard block letters, as if his uncle never wanted to say too much. But every page carried the same weight. This was never meant to be hidden forever. It was meant to protect. Helen Brooks joined them at the mouth of the tunnel, her dark coat zipped high against the morning chill. Her silver hair was tied back, her face pale against the cold, but her green eyes burned with steady purpose. She carried a small leather satchel over her shoulder, filled with notes, copies of old maps, and a recorder. Two members of the town council followed her down the steps, Roy Tanner and Linda Gray. Roy moved slowly, but solidly, his heavy frame steady even on the damp steps. His broad hands were calloused from years working lumber, and though he said little, his eyes scanned everything with a builder's precision. Linda walked with quiet confidence, tall and composed, black hair pulled into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She carried a flashlight, her fingers gripping it like someone who didn't scare easily. Scout led the way deeper into the tunnel, tail lowered, paws moving with cautious certainty. Daniel followed closely, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim air. The tunnel felt colder than usual. The walls sweated with moisture, and the ground carried the soft echo of their steps. As they reached the far end of the tunnel, Scout suddenly froze. His head lifted, his nose tilted toward the wall. A faint current of air moved past Daniel's ankles. It was subtle, but clear. There was something behind that wall. Daniel crouched beside the dog, pressing his hand near the seam. Cold air brushed against his skin. He looked at Roy and Linda. Roy grunted softly, nodding once. Linda raised the beam of light higher, revealing a rough patch of cement that didn't match the surrounding structure. Roy stepped forward with quiet efficiency. He had brought a small hammer and chisel in his bag, tools he trusted more than words. He began to chip away at the cement. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat through the tunnel. Linda steadied the light. Daniel and Scout watched closely. Dust clouded the air with each blow. After several minutes, a thin crack ran down the center of the patch. A second draft of cold air seeped through. Roy struck it once more with a sharp blow, and part of the wall gave way, revealing a dark space beyond. Daniel climbed forward first, pulling away loose fragments. What lay beyond was not just another tunnel. It was a narrow chamber, maybe no more than 2 meters wide, its walls lined with rough stone. And at the far end, half hidden by years of dirt and overgrowth, was an iron door bent slightly at the hinges. Beyond it, a faint wash of natural light slipped in, a passage that led to the forest beyond the shop. Linda breathed out softly, the kind of breath people take when they realize they're standing in a piece of history. Helen stepped forward, her eyes wide, her fingers lightly tracing the stonework. She said this was exactly what the old documents had hinted at: a secondary route, likely a safe exit for those fleeing under cover of night. Daniel walked toward a small wooden crate near the door. It was coated in dust, but intact. He pried it open gently. Inside were several cloth bags, brittle with age but still sealed. Beneath them lay a stack of old photographs. edges curled and yellowed, and a handful of letters tied with twine. In the bottom of the crate, folded carefully and sealed in waxed paper, was a large map. It bore the unmistakable name, Harbor Line. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Scout stood still, tail slightly wagging, ears flicking in the faint breeze from the forest. Daniel held the map carefully in his hands, the weight of it both fragile and unshakable. This wasn't just proof. It was the heartbeat of the story itself. Helen's voice was low but firm. This changes everything. Roy nodded slowly, his calloused hands resting on the broken cement wall. Linda's expression hardened, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet resolve Daniel recognized from people who had decided which side of a line they stood on. When they emerged back outside, the morning fog had lifted. The skyline fence still surrounded the property, and two men in security jackets stood near the gate. They were broad-shouldered, dressed in black, their faces closed and impassive. Skyline had tightened its grip. Daniel felt the air shift around him. This was no longer about a quiet discovery. It was a fight. As Helen and the council members carried the evidence toward the waiting cars, Daniel looked back at the entrance to the tunnel. Scout stood beside him, ears high, tail steady. He felt the weight in his chest again, but it was no longer a lonely weight. This was bigger than him, bigger than a shop, bigger than a single story. It was history, fighting to stay alive. The night air was crisp and quiet, the kind that carries sound like a long-held breath. A thin crescent moon hung over Clearwater, and the frost on the ground shimmered faintly beneath the pale light. Inside the garage, Daniel Harris sat at his workbench, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. Scout slept near the pit, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The last few days had felt like standing on a bridge between past and present, with history pressing in from both sides. Daniel's eyes burned from lack of sleep. The letter from the State Preservation Board sat unfolded on the bench, the ink still fresh. The Harbor Line site had been granted temporary historic protection. It was a win, but Skyline had not disappeared. Their security still lingered like a shadow at the edges of the property. Scout's ears twitched. Then his head snapped up. The soft rumble in his chest began low, almost a growl swallowed back. Daniel froze, hand instinctively tightening around the handle of his flashlight. Scout moved toward the back door, silent and focused, every step precise. That kind of stillness from him was never false alarm. Daniel moved quietly to the wall, flicked off the lamp, and listened. There it was. The faint creak of the outer fence, followed by a soft thud on the gravel. At least two sets of footsteps. He breathed slowly, the muscle memory of years past settling into his body like an old coat. Three figures moved through the darkness outside, dressed in black. Their steps were careful, but not professional enough to be invisible. The tallest moved with a limp. The second dragged a boot slightly, and the third was smaller, quick. None of them carried lights. Scout gave a short, low bark sharp enough to cut through the night. One of the men cursed softly. Daniel used the moment to grab his phone and call the sheriff's department. His voice was calm when he reported the break-in, but underneath it, his pulse thudded like a drum. Outside, the intruders reached the garage door and tried to force the lock. Scout launched forward with the kind of speed that only years of training could give. His bark shattered the quiet, deep and commanding. The men froze for a heartbeat, then one of them swung a crowbar against the door. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the night. Daniel stepped forward, flashlight in one hand, a wrench in the other. His voice was steady as he shouted at them to back away. Scout growled at his side, teeth bared. Two of the intruders bolted toward the fence. The third hesitated, then stumbled after them when the distant wail of sirens broke the night. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights washed over the property. Sheriff Blake Nolan arrived with two deputies. Blake was a man in his mid-50s, broad in the shoulders, with a square jaw dusted in gray stubble. He had dark eyes that always seemed to be measuring something silently. He wore his years in uniform, like a second skin, steady, cautious, but carrying a quiet frustration with things that smelled too much like power being misused. He asked Daniel for the details while deputies swept the area. Scout sat close, ears still sharp, but no longer tense. Daniel explained what he had heard and seen. Blake nodded slowly, already knowing who was likely behind this. He had been watching Skyline's sudden interest in the harbor line with growing suspicion. By morning, the break-in was front-page news. The local reporters had pieced the story together quickly. What began as a small-town discovery now rippled far beyond Clearwater. Investigative journalists from the state capitol began digging into Skyline's records. What they found wasn't new construction plans. It was a series of confidential memos showing Skyline had known about the tunnel system for years. They had been maneuvering to quietly claim the land, bury the history, and build over it. Helen Brooks arrived at the garage with two folders tucked under her arm. Her silver hair was wind-blown, her cheeks flushed with a determined light. She handed Daniel the newspaper, with the headline splashed across the front. State investigators probe Skyline Holdings over historic site scandal. Later that week, officials from the State Preservation Office and the Attorney General's office arrived in Clearwater. Their presence was quiet but firm, a kind of authority Skyline couldn't simply brush away. After 2 days of hearings and interviews, Skyline's permits were suspended. Their security fence was ordered down. The harbor line site was officially recognized as a temporary state heritage site. Daniel stood in front of the garage as the workers removed the metal fencing. The air felt different, lighter. Helen stood beside him, her scarf trailing in the wind. She told him the town council had agreed to help establish a preservation trust, and the recovered gold and artifacts from the tunnel would be placed in a fund. That fund would support refugee aid programs and veterans in need, a living echo of the harbor line's purpose. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he had not let himself feel fully: relief. Scout pressed against his leg, tail sweeping the gravel slowly. The sun set behind the pines, painting the sky with a soft gold. Daniel thought about his uncle's words in the notebook. When fear rules, let this path carry the light. It finally made sense now. The harbor line had once saved lives. Now it would protect stories and help people again. Daniel placed his hand on Scout's head, the dog's warm fur grounding him in the quiet. The fight wasn't over, but the ground beneath him no longer felt like a burden. It felt like home. The morning was crisp and golden, the kind that carries the scent of pine needles and new beginnings. A gentle breeze rolled down from the northern ridge, stirring the red banners that had been strung between the trees around the old garage. The air held the sound of footsteps, laughter, and camera shutters. For the first time in decades, the harbor line tunnel no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to people again. Daniel Harris stood near the entrance of the tunnel, his hands tucked into the pockets of a freshly pressed dark brown jacket. The fabric was still stiff. He wasn't used to clothes like these. Scout stood proudly beside him, a red bandana tied neatly around his neck, its fabric fluttering softly in the wind. The German shepherd's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his amber eyes bright and alert. Over the past months, the town had started calling him the symbol of the living road. It made Daniel smile quietly every time he heard it. Helen Brooks moved between the crowd with an ease that only came from deep respect. Her silver hair caught the morning light like spun thread, and her dark green coat gave her a kind of quiet authority. She had spent a lifetime fighting to keep history alive. Today, she was watching it breathe. Hundreds of people had gathered along the newly cleared path to the forest entrance. Locals stood shoulder to shoulder with journalists, state officials, and visitors from other towns. Wooden tables were covered with coffee, pastries, and stacks of pamphlets explaining the history of the harbor line. A group of school children stood at the front, holding small flags with the tunnel's emblem, a simple outline of a lantern. Daniel scanned the crowd slowly. His heart wasn't pounding like it had on the night of the break-in or during the hearings. This time, it felt steady, warm. For years, he had lived in survival mode. Today, he could finally stand still. Helen climbed up the small wooden platform built near the tunnel mouth. She spoke with her usual clarity, telling the story of the harbor line not as a legend, but as truth woven through generations. She spoke of the people who had built it, of the courage that had walked through its darkness, and of the night it almost disappeared under corporate greed. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with conviction. When she finished, the crowd broke into quiet applause, not the loud kind meant to celebrate spectacle, but the kind that carries respect. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to moments like this. Scout pressed his shoulder against Daniel's leg, as if he knew exactly what was sitting behind his silence. Then a small ripple moved through the crowd as a black car pulled up at the edge of the field. A man in his late 70s stepped out slowly, using a polished wooden cane for support. He was tall but thin, his frame slightly bent with age. His hair was white and swept neatly back, and his skin had the faint bronze tone of someone who had spent his younger years outdoors. His name was Arthur Lane. Arthur's blue wool coat hung loosely over his frame, but his posture held dignity. His pale gray eyes were sharp, as if they had never forgotten anything. Helen walked to greet him with gentle respect. She had told Daniel about this visitor. Arthur had traveled from Canada after seeing the news. As a child, he had been one of those who escaped through the harbor line. Arthur moved slowly toward the entrance of the tunnel, the crowd parting for him in silence. In his left hand, he carried a small lantern, its glass polished to a faint shimmer. With careful movements, he placed the lantern at the base of the stone arch. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression was calm. When he spoke, his voice was thin but clear. He said that when he was 8 years old, a group of strangers guided him and his sister through this tunnel in the dead of winter. He remembered the smell of wet stone, the sound of breathing in the dark, and a single warm hand that held his as they climbed out into freedom on the other side. That night, he said, saved his life. Daniel stood frozen for a moment. The tunnel had always felt like a story carved into concrete. Hearing Arthur's voice turned it into something living, something that reached across generations. His hands tightened in his pockets to keep from shaking. As the sun climbed higher, state officials stepped forward with Helen to officially dedicate the site as a permanent historical landmark. A brass plaque was unveiled at the entrance, bearing the name Harbor Line and a short inscription, "For those who walked in darkness toward the light." Daniel approached the tunnel with a wooden sign he had carved himself over the past week. The letters were simple, burned into the grain with a steady hand, "Always open to those who need a way out." He hung it gently beside the plaque. Scout sat at his feet, the red bandana bright against the gray stone. The dog lifted his head toward the breeze, ears pricked, eyes calm. For years, Daniel had felt like his life was built on shifting ground. Now, standing here, with the wind carrying the sound of laughter and stories, it finally felt solid. Helen touched his shoulder lightly. She told him the board had officially named him the first director of the Harbor Line Historical Center. It would be his job to preserve this place, to protect it, and to share its story. He would have steady work, a team, a purpose that wasn't built on running from the past. Arthur stood beside him, his cane planted firmly in the earth, watching the sunlight spill across the entrance. His eyes were wet, but his smile was steady. As the first golden light of day poured through the gap between the pines, Scout rose and walked to stand next to Daniel at the archway. The two of them watched as the crowd drifted down the mountain road, carrying pieces of the story with them. Daniel took a slow breath, letting the cold air settle deep into his chest. For the first time in a very long time, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. In the quiet after the ceremony, as the last rays of sunlight brushed the tunnel walls, Daniel stood still with Scout at his side. Around them, the forest held its breath, as if the past and present were stitched together in that single golden moment. The harbor line had once been a hidden path carved in darkness to save lives. Now, it had become a beacon, a bridge between generations, a place where faith and courage whispered to anyone willing to listen. This story was never just about old stone and forgotten maps. It was about ordinary people who chose light over fear, about hands that helped strangers, about a dog's instinct, a veteran's courage, a community's voice, and the quiet power of remembering. In every corner of the world, there are small roads like Harbor Line, roads built from kindness, hope, and faith. Perhaps miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they are a single lantern left burning, a hand that reaches out in the dark, or a heart that refuses to give up. Just as God guided souls through the shadows long ago, He still guides us through storms in our daily lives. May this story remind each of us to protect what matters, to love fiercely, and to stand together. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs light. Leave a comment, subscribe, and join in prayer for God's blessing upon every soul walking their own dark path, waiting for a way out. May faith light their road as it once did here.